Heather, it's great to have you on the show. Would you please let your audience know a little bit about your background, what you're doing now? Because it sounds like you're doing some very unique things with leaders.
Yes, yes. So happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And I would say probably a great place to start is the fact that I've been self-employed for 17 years, going into my 17th year. And before that, I was a high school drama teacher. So being self-employed has really been a self-training experience, including the latest level of my work, which is really moving into working with highly sensitive leaders and how highly sensitives are really such an asset to the workplace, as well as make excellent leaders themselves, as long as there's a willingness to take a different approach. So
Has the White House contacted you to do a little work in there? I mean, I'm just I don't want to get political, but sorry, I
I
couldn't
would
resist.
just only hope.
Anyway, I don't want to go down that path. But so tell me. By the way, you were doing the drama thing, and didn't you? Isn't it in your profile that you did some work with Bette Midler?
I did, yes.
Oh, that must have been so much fun.
It was a really, really special opportunity. I feel so grateful to have had that experience. I worked very closely with her in an inner city school in here in New York City.
Oh, well, that's cool. Do you have like one memory that when you think back on it, just always comes to mind?
Yes, and it has to do with when I was choosing to leave teaching. So I'd been working at that school and then therefore closely with Bette for 3 years. And I was making this big life transition, becoming self-employed. My first business was as a nutrition and wellness coach. And I remember so specifically that Bette came up to me after one of the productions of a musical that I had directed that year. And she came up to me and she said, "I hear you're leaving. What's going on? What are you doing?" And I said to her, "Oh, well, I'm going to start my own business as a nutrition and wellness coach." And she was probably about 3 inches from my face. And she just looked at me and she goes, "Well, that's out there." And I was like, yes. It did not really feel like a massive vote of confidence from Bette Midler when I was offering, up the fact that I was vulnerably going into this new path. But I did it anyway.
So that kind of makes me think of, you went and made this drastic change. What happened where you wanted to make the change to the nutrition health coach, but then also you've evolved into this highly sensitive um, entrepreneur movement, which you've been leading, I think, what is it, since 2010? But I mean, what were kind of the triggers that made you think, oh, I got to do this, I got to do it now?
Yeah, absolutely. There definitely was a trigger. So, as I said, I started my first business as a nutrition and wellness coach. And then that business evolved into supporting other wellness practitioners and being able to be full time in their business. And I was cooking right along, doing that work and loving it deeply. And then in 2010, I brought my business across, actually, it was the year before that, 2009. I brought my business across $1 million mark for the first time. And I would love to say that it was like this amazing experience. And I feel like I really met a milestone and reached a goal. And none of that is what it was like for me at all. It was actually extremely overwhelming, massively overexhausting. I was absolutely overworked, and I really started questioning everything that I was doing, and really went into what I would absolutely say in hindsight was a dark night of the soul, and really engaged in some massive self-inquiry because I was really asking myself, if this is what it means to be successfully self-employed, then I'm not really sure that this is what I'm meant to be doing. And if this is what I'm not meant to be doing, then what am I meant to be doing? Because Bette Midler did not save me a seat in my old job. And through that time, I discovered that I was a highly sensitive person. And I had never even heard that term before. I didn't know what that meant. But I was led to a woman whose name is Dr. Elaine Aron, and she is one of the founding researchers on the highly sensitive person. And once I learned what it meant, I really understood, okay, this really makes a difference. And it didn't surprise me so much, again, once I understood the term, it didn't surprise me that I was highly sensitive, but what did surprise me was how highly sensitive I was. And from there, I took one of Dr. Aaron's assessments into a group of 25 women entrepreneurs that I was working with at the time, all in the wellness field. And I'm a true believer that your ideal client is a version of you. And as a result, every single woman in that room was also highly sensitive. What was really key about that moment was that there was not one woman in that room who wanted to be highly sensitive. They really saw it as a negative label. They saw it as a detriment. They saw it as a weakness. And that was a massive light bulb moment for me, because now this wasn't just about how I needed to do things differently for myself in business, but I saw it was very much needed by others as well. And that really was the start.
Okay, so all the men on the podcast, you got to stay on and hear this, whatever it is. And I don't know where it's going. Okay, but we have the opposite reputation. The women have the reputation of being too sensitive. Am I right, Heather? Is that but the men have the opposite. We're not sensitive enough. So come on, we got to learn this. We got to work through this and see. Some of you men, by the way, I don't know. I suspect, Heather, if they took an assessment, might find out they're actually highly sensitive. But we're not going to go there. But
Well,
or you can go. You can go there.
yeah, this is what's really important about that, is that there's a difference between being a sensitive person and being highly sensitive. So let me just talk about what it actually means to be highly sensitive for a moment. And so according to Dr. Aaron and her work, there are 20% of us who are born into the world highly sensitive. And what that means is that your nervous system is wired differently than someone who's not highly sensitive. And what that means is that your nervous system takes in stimulation at a much higher degree than someone who is not highly sensitive. So anything that might be stimulating to the nervous system, sight, sound, smell, information, energy, is going to be registered for a highly sensitive person at, again, a much higher degree. So what does that equal out to? Well, it just basically equals to that your experience in the world is very different. And mostly because your nervous system is processing the stimulation of experiencing the world very differently. And so that's what we're really talking about. So the fact that there's 20% and that are born into the world fully male and
Really,
female,
equally?
and so that equally, so that's very different than just what is being taught as acceptable culturally or not. And also, again, very different from just if a person happens to be sensitive in nature, different than being highly sensitive.
Do you happen to know the numbers that kind of validate these percentages? How many people were involved in the studies or whatever the research?
I don't have that right in front of me, but in addition to reading Dr. Arendt's book, I have actually read her case studies, and so I don't have those numbers right in front of me. But very easy to find on the internet for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. So you got 20% that are highly sensitive. What are the other ranges and what are the percentages there?
When you say other ranges, just tell me more about what you
Well,
mean.
wouldn't you go from highly sensitive to not sensitive at all or something like that?
I don't have that information because I really focus on the people who are highly sensitive.
Okay. Okay. So what I heard you say, and maybe I missed it, was a lot of the sensitivity had to do with environmental aspects. But I would suspect that sensitivity also has to do relationally, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So again, it's all about the nervous system and the way that the nervous system is processing stimulation. So in my work, I've actually taken that and moved it into an identification of what I refer to as the top 12 HSE, highly sensitive entrepreneur strengths, and the top 12 HSE shadows. And so, for example, some of the top shadows is, first of all, overwhelm is absolutely a number one. And a shadow is when you're not really understanding how to work with your nervous system, but really feel like you're just a slave to the overstimulation. So overwhelm is a shadow. There's also a shadow of over responsibility. And that really comes from the fact that because you can sense very much of, say, what's needed in an environment, as well as what's needed for another person, that you feel that you are then responsible for taking care of those needs. There's also the shadow of overprotection. A lot of highly sensitives have such a concern about becoming overwhelmed that they tend to overprotect themselves. But then we have these strengths, and that's really what we tap into in the work that I do, is how to really, again, be able to manage your nervous system so that you're operating from your highly sensitive strengths and really having those work for you in your service-based business. And those strengths are something like highly sensitives are extremely empathic. We are extremely intuitive. We absolutely are very fine-tuned into subtleties of environment. And we also are very deep thinkers, deep listeners, deep feelers. And these are excellent skills when it comes to being a service-based entrepreneur and also a leader. Again, when you really know how to have your nervous system work for you rather than against you.
So I'm curious, with the people you've worked with, do you have kind of like a before and after example of someone becoming more aware of their high sensitivity and then learning how to apply it more effectively, and what that changed?
Oh my gosh, yes, so many. And I think really, even before going into some of those stories, what I'll mention is another part of my work that I refer to as the HSE coping mechanisms. And there's three mechanisms that I've identified, and they're what I refer to as a pusher, that's a coping mechanism, a hider is a coping mechanism, or a combo platter is a coping mechanism. So very quickly, a pusher will get done what someone who's not highly sensitive will get done, or I like to call them the 80 percenters, will get done what an 80 percenter will get done, but it will come at a very high cost to the highly sensitive. And that was definitely my experience. And that cost is often in the form of, health issues and crisis, relationship issues and crisis. A hider will tend to hide from any kind of action that will risk them possibly becoming overwhelmed. And a combo platter is where you vacillate back and forth between the two. So when it comes to the before and afters, the first person that comes to mind for me is one of the members in the Business Miracles community, Brianna, and she's a $2 million business owner. And when she first came into Business Miracles and receiving HSE mentoring, she was operating just underneath the $1 million mark and was massively in that pusher coping mechanism. She was wired so tightly, and she was practically operating on fumes. And though she had the business moving along, was always just feeling like one step behind. Where we have her now is obviously there's been the income increase, but even more than that is Brianna is so much more centered within herself, operates from her strengths, has learned to build a team that are working from their strengths, and then therefore they are each individual stewards of her company's mission, and then therefore there's less needed from Brianna in terms of that micromanaging. So that's a great example. And I can also speak to the person who literally just has an idea. They feel called to start a business. And that's the case for so many highly sensitives because we're so good at, being things like wellness practitioners or coaches or consultants. And so they feel called to be in business, but just the idea of how to actually get themselves out there to start marketing and selling feels so, intimidating and overwhelming. And we have so many who come into the mentoring in that space and then are able to, within 9 months time, or whatever the pace for each individual is, be in a place where they're actually able to make connections, enroll clients, be generating income, and starting to build a life that really serves and supports who they are as a highly sensitive and what they feel like they need. So those are two extreme examples, and I can fill in a whole bunch in between too.
Well, you may in the course of the podcast, but I'm kind of curious. So you've given us some indications of how we can have an idea we might be highly sensitive and be part of that 20% or not. I'm kind of curious as I'm working with other people and whether I have a good working relationship or our relationship or their performance is not ideal. How can I start to wonder or consider is part of the issue that they might be a highly sensitive person, and actually if they understood that could focus themselves, apply themselves, play to their strengths better or whatever.
Yeah, it's a great question, and really a question that I believe that, so many organizations, companies, businesses, schools really need to start asking, because it makes such a difference in terms of what you're able to experience when it comes to productivity, and so much energy that's wasted, in trying to have somebody be someone that they're not, or making them wrong for being who they are. So the first is really just the awareness, right? Just that keen awareness that you displayed in asking the question. And that does require, in my opinion, a sophistication and from a leader, is first and foremost to recognize that not everyone is like you, and that not everyone is meant to be like you, and that there's nothing wrong with others not being like you. And it sounds so simple, but it's really actually, unfortunately, quite profound. And when you can be in that space of awareness, then from there, you can start to identify, what types of strengths are needed in different areas throughout the business, the company, the organization. And within that identification, where do you need someone who does process more deeply? Perhaps you need finer listening skills. You need someone who can really be able to empathize with the person who's sitting across the table from them or on the phone with them, and put themselves in another person's shoes. And that's a great direction to start. And then from there, either looking at the people who are currently on your team or as you're hiring, and start to use some of the information and qualities that are really indicative of who a highly sensitive person is, and start plugging those people intentionally into those roles on your team.
So I'm curious, do you find that highly sensitive people, a certain percentage of them tend to be ADD or ADHD because they've got this super sensitivity, so they can kind of sense one thing and move in that direction, and then have trouble and move back in another direction? Or is the opposite true, or is there no kind of um,
Yeah, I,
majority there?
I personally don't have the research or stats on that. I would be so curious about that myself. I haven't seen any specific research that connects, you know, those types of, personality processing with being highly sensitive. I will say from my experience and the hundreds that I've mentored and who I've served through the Business Miracles mentoring programs, I don't see that correlation. But that also might be in regards to what type of person is attracted to being self-employed. I actually tend to see more of the opposite, which is the highly sensitive will pull back because of a sense of being stimulated, right? So once you start to have this awareness, you can even say, put yourself in a boardroom meeting, and the highly sensitive will be the person who's kind of cringing because maybe like there's some construction noise outside. So like they're hearing, both the construction noise and what's happening. They can't really focus if there's multiple conversations happening at once. They're the one in the room who's noticing it's too cold, it's too hot, the lights are too high, they're too low. And the highly sensitive will either like work really hard. That's where the coping mechanisms of pushing and hiding come in, to push their way through so that they're not bothered by those aspects in the meeting, or they will really withdraw and just really, they'll be the quiet person in the room, but it's not necessarily because they're shy or even that they're introverted, but they're just managing their nervous system.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems also almost like the highly sensitive person is so much aware of the different things that are going on, that part of the thing that they may have a heightened awareness of that some entrepreneurs do not is the pain of failure. So they have this focus you're talking about, like you were able to drive your business and your people you're helping. They have this sensitivity, and they're able to kind of, that, not an unhealthy fear, but a healthy fear of, I got to make certain I'm focused here, because if I step off this way, then it's going to set me back. And so that's a problem. Am I hearing you correctly, that that might be one of the positive attributes potentially?
I would say potentially, like
Okay.
one highly sensitive entrepreneur really learns to operate more from their strengths, as I mentioned earlier, then yes, absolutely. When they're unaware of, one, just if they're highly sensitive, and then two, if they are aware that they're highly sensitive, but they're not aware of how to manage that, then again, that can really show up more in that hiding coping mechanism, where there's such a fear of failure that it will actually prevent the entrepreneur from taking the actions that they need to take to move the business forward.
Yeah, it makes sense. So you've mentioned a couple times this business miracles thing. Everybody on the podcast wants a miracle. So can you explain that a little bit, please?
Yeah, for sure. So, where this comes from is I personally have been a student of the psychological and spiritual curriculum referred to as A Course in Miracles. And I've been a student of that work since I was a teenager, really around 14, 15. My mother had died in a bicycle accident when I was 14 years
Oh,
old.
sorry.
Thank you. And so that just really led me on a spiritual path, I think perhaps sooner than most people. And according to that teaching, the definition of a miracle is a shift in perception. So
And who does that teaching?
it's so I'm not necessarily a full expert in this, but I will say that the work came through a woman who is a psychologist and researcher at Columbia University in the 70s. Her name is Ellen Schuckman,
Oh,
and but she is not necessarily. She's no longer with us, but she would not say that she is the author of the work, but she is more of like the channeler of the work.
okay.
So if anyone's heard of Marianne Williamson started her work a lot under A Course in Miracles. And so again, back to just that, the definition of a miracle, according to that curriculum, is a shift in perception. So when I first learned that I was highly sensitive, as I shared earlier, and started to see that this is an area that really needed to be served, one of the connections that I made for myself and then for others is that is what is needed for a highly sensitive to be able to be successful in business. They need a shift in perception. They need to be able to first see themselves differently. And that comes from that most of us who are highly sensitive, we're not taught as a young person how to really work with this aspect of our nature. Most of us didn't even really know. Dr. Aaron's work didn't start until the 1990s. So anyone who's older than that, you most likely did not have any support. And so most of us grew up with this idea that there's something wrong with us because we learned early on that, oh wait, I'm thinking about things differently than most of the other people, in my class, in my school, in my sorority, what have you. So there must be something wrong with me. So we need to shift that perception. And then there also needs to be a shift in perception in terms of what it means to be in business, And then there needs to be a shift in perception in regards to how to operate in business, to go about business. There really needs to be a willingness to do things differently. And so that's where the name of A Course in Business Miracles came from. And then therefore that's the name of the umbrella community that supports all of the mentoring programs that I offer for highly sensitive entrepreneurs.
So, not to put you on the spot, but at the same time to put you on the spot. So can you slow it down on each of those three areas? Maybe give a tangible example
Yes,
with each one?
absolutely.
That might be helpful for the audience.
For sure. So again, really a shift in perception is needed, first and foremost, with how you view yourself. So as I started to share, most highly sensitives tend to have the experience of unconsciously learning early on that they are different. So if you just look again back to the stats from Dr. Aaron, there's 20% of us who are highly sensitive and 80% who are not. So the highly sensitive will often feel like the odd person out. You will feel like because you process information, process stimulation differently, that again, there's something wrong with you. So a shift in perception from that there's something wrong with you, or again, those first 25 women that I had take that assessment, they saw it as a weakness. There needs to become a shift into, actually, I have something very unique to bring to the table in whatever, whatever field of business the entrepreneur is in. And a shift from weakness into a shift of strength. I bring a strength to the table that someone who's not highly sensitive can't bring. So that's the first shift.
So can I ask you a question before you go to the next one? So do you work with people who are not highly sensitive themselves, but teach them how to work effectively with people who are highly sensitive?
I don't specifically do that work, except for within one of the programs that I offer, the highly sensitive leader. I do have a portion of that program where I support those leaders with a significant relationship. So whether that's a spouse or a parent or child or sibling or a key coworker. And so I do that work. I definitely would say that work is very much needed. And as I mentioned earlier, especially in the workplace, for those who are not highly sensitive, to be able to understand more clearly how to really work effectively with those of us who are.
Okay, sorry I interrupted.
That's okay.
Please, yeah.
So the next is then a shift in perception in terms of how you look at business. So what that means is that I know for myself, my experience when I first went from being a high school teacher into basically a self-education about what it meant to be self-employed. I would be attending a lot of trainings in regards for marketing and sales. And looking back on it, it's very clear that there was basically a one track approach to how to effectively market, how to have an effective selling conversation. And as a highly sensitive, you have to kind of turn all of that on its head. And so, for example, that's what I did with selling. And first for myself, and this was even before I realized that I was highly sensitive, I started to re-engineer all of the pieces that are typically taught about how to have a successful selling conversation. And I designed a process to sell that, again, at the time I didn't realize, but now I can see I was designing it to really utilize my HSE strengths of being a deep listener and a deep thinker and a deep feeler. And I was slowing down the selling process and taking it away from the traditional pressure and more fear-oriented approach that tends to be taught and often works really well for someone who's not highly sensitive. So that's just one example about how you can take anything and everything that's basically been taught about how you need to operate in order to have a successful business and redesign it so that it really works for your highly sensitive needs. And so then that speaks to taking a whole new approach to operations as well, which again is so much of what I teach my highly sensitive leaders. And Brianna, who I mentioned earlier, is a great example where she was trying really, really hard to get those like traditional team, approaches to work for her. And it was working, but coming at a very, very high cost. And we've completely flipped the switch on all of it. And she's 100 times happier, has more time with her family and young daughter, and is making more money.
Awesome. Awesome. And then what about the third piece then? So
Sorry,
there
I
were
kind
three,
of
right?
blended the second and the third piece together.
Oh, you did. Okay, that's what I was kind of wondering. So that's okay. So
Yeah,
I'm curious. You mentioned that there's an equal number of men and women that are highly sensitive, and does the sensitivity display itself in different ways between the men and the women, and how it affects them?
it really doesn't. Again, according to Dr. Aaron's research, and the 50-50 comes from her work. And, according to the research that she's done, as well as from what I can see in those that I've had the opportunity to mentor, it doesn't display itself differently, but it is dealt with differently because of the cultural impact. I think we can all agree that culturally, pretty much worldwide, it is less acceptable, and you mentioned this earlier yourself, for a man to be considered sensitive versus a woman. I will say just in the last few years, highly sensitive men have started to find their way to me and my work as HSEs. And all of the work that I do is rewarding, but that work is significantly rewarding because most of these men are suffering greatly, as many of the female HSEs as well, but much more to a degree because it is so silent and secretive for them. And they really are operating under a greater sense that there's something wrong with them. And once they really start to learn how to work with their sensitive nature and have it really working for them in their business, there's again an exponential reward because that man is able to come into not only their HSE strengths, but they're able to come into a sense of purpose. And then therefore also I assume, I haven't actually specifically asked this question or had them tell me, but I assume a fulfillment of, oh, I am now able to provide, where before I was really struggling with that. And so that piece of the work is very rewarding.
So I'm kind of curious. So I'm listening to all this. I'll be candid with you. I'm thinking I'm a pretty sensitive guy, but I don't know whether I'm highly sensitive. And I certainly have part of me that's not too sensitive because I can be super direct, type A almost personality. So if I was a man or a woman, and I'm considering what you're saying, what might be some indicators that this might be me and I need to look into it, or this might be that other person that I'm trying to work better with or live with more happily or whatever, and I need to understand it better so I can better connect with this other person?
Right, absolutely. So it really goes back to those shadows and those strengths, right? So I'll definitely say, like, I am married to a very sensitive man who is not highly sensitive. And so my husband is, he's a psychotherapist and he's so good at what he does. But we live in New York City and we approach the city very differently. My husband literally bikes around the city all day going to like different appointments, and I do everything I can to just keep myself from not having to go on the subway. So it's really like how you interpret and approach the environment. You can go back to those kind of first layer of questions. Are you a person that when you walk into a space you immediately are able to tune into, is it too loud, is it too quiet, are the lights up? Are they down? What's the artwork on the wall? Someone who's highly sensitive is going to just notice those things without trying. Someone who's not is going to say, what artwork? or I don't know what was the music. I don't know what you're talking about, or to be in a restaurant and to have a conversation when it's very, very loud, which is again very more and more a typical thing of being in New York City, is very hard for me. My husband will just carry on a conversation regardless. And then you can take it to, the next layer, which is really about how tuned in you tend to be to a person's experience. Do you find yourself that you can almost like finish someone else's sentences? Can you anticipate someone's needs before they even ask? Those are also indicators that most likely you're highly sensitive. Or does that not even cross your mind? Are you not distracted by what another person in the room may or may not be experiencing? And then you can take it further, working with some of the assessments that are available, including the one that I offer for entrepreneurs is really, a great place to start, because it will literally tell you where you fall when it comes to being highly sensitive or not.
So this sounds like a good time to kind of segue over and tell people how to get a hold of you, maybe check out your assessment, because if this is making them think that they need to do some introspection or consider, how do I work better with this person, doing at least one of the assessments to see what it's like. And
Absolutely.
it seems like it's a good investment. This is one of those conversations after we're done, I'm going to be thinking about for a while.
Good. I'm so happy to hear that. Absolutely. Assessment makes such a difference. Again, whether you're listening and you're thinking it's me or maybe it's somebody else. I mean, I will definitely say I've already mentioned my sweetheart husband, and understanding that I'm highly sensitive radically changed things in our marriage, absolutely for the better. And I've heard that from so many others, those that I mentor. Improvements in personal relationships absolutely happen in addition to, increase in business success. But honestly, I've heard that from I'll hear from other podcast hosts that interview me, and they'll come back, they'll be like, oh my gosh, my wife's highly sensitive. It's changed everything. I definitely recommend an assessment for sure.
So how do they get a hold of you? Where do they go? And how do they learn more?
Yes. So again, a great place to start would be www.hsequiz.com. hsequiz.com, and that is where you'll find the assessment. It's really not a quiz. You can't pass or fail, but HSE quiz makes a better URL than HSE assessment. So you'll find the quiz there for you, the assessment there for you. It's very easy to take. And as you click through, once you're complete, you'll find out if you are either somewhat highly sensitive or super highly sensitive, or if you're like me, you're super uber highly sensitive. And then wherever you fall there, you'll receive a free success guide at the end of the assessment, along with your score, that will give you those first steps of how to really start to work with being somewhat super or super uber HSE.
Awesome. hscquiz.com. And is there a cost for that, or is that free?
That's free.
That's free. What a deal. You cannot go wrong. Now you have to go take the assessment. I mean, this is a
Absolutely.
no-brainer.
Yes.
And then if they want to get a hold of you, can they do that from that website, or is there a better website to learn more about your miracle business miracles community, or anything else you're doing?
Yes. So you can find out more information at businessmiracles.com. Businessmiracles.com.
Super. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us, Heather. This has been
Yeah.
interesting. I'm gonna go take the quiz. I have to go take the quiz. So
Well,
I'll
definitely.
I'll see what's going on.
Yeah, good. I'm so glad.